eyes. And it's now such that it's about to get over there far enough that this evening it was going to be all right the rest of the evening. We're in Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 2. And as we've spent a couple of weeks already, one introducing it, and then last week we looked at the first chapter. I hope to cover the second chapter tonight, at least most of it, if we don't get the entire second chapter. The book of Daniel itself is a book which we considered a book of prophecy, but the Hebrew text has it amongst the wisdom literature. And the more I study it, the more I think it's more like wisdom literature than it is prophecy, even though it has prophecy in it, much the same as the Psalms. And I think much of the focus of particularly this first part of the book is on two things. One is who is wise, and the other is who's the ruler. That's the two things we're going to see focused on early in the book. And so in the first chapters we looked at last week, if I can get this going the right direction, turn it on. Well, let me try the other one. I always have trouble with this thing for some reason. Okay, we'll go without that. Okay, thank you. Okay, last week we looked at the first chapter in the book of Daniel, and it's a couple of things that we covered in the first chapter. It was the introduction to captivity. It told us who went to captivity, who took them there, and we see the people that went to captivity were a faithful group of Jews from Jerusalem. They were taken to captivity. And the first chapter is primarily about creating counselors for the king. And we end up in the first chapter, we have two groups of counselors created, and that's going to be significant in the second chapter. We have the group of counselors that are created by the king's proclamation. And then we have a group of counselors that are created because they wouldn't adapt to all of the king's requirements, because that would have defiled them as Hebrews. And these counselors are created based on their faith in God and their dependence on God. At the end of the first chapter, it makes a statement that these four, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were 10 times better than the other counselors that were created. And I think that the point of the first chapter was the wisest people, true wisdom comes from depending on God or having faith in God. Now, the second chapter is going to be a chapter of proof. We're going to see we have the one group of counselors who are developed based upon Babylonian idolatry, Babylonian teaching, Babylonian wisdom. And we're going to have the four counselors who were developed based on faith in God. And we're going to have a contest here in the second chapter for this group of people. So one thing I want to just note is that the first chapter is integrally connected to the second chapter. They're not two independent stories. They're a continuation of thought, because the last words of the first chapter are, Daniel could interpret dreams. Well, we begin the second chapter. We're going to begin with a problem with a dream. In the second chapter, I think there's a couple of ways we can look at the second chapter. There are two questions that are already mentioned are in the second chapter. One is, who rules? And the question is, does Nebuchadnezzar rule or does God rule? That's one of the primary questions of the second chapter. And the other question of the second chapter is, who's the wise ones? He needs some wise men, and we see there are two groups of wise men. And again, we're going to see, are it the Babylonians or is it the people with faith in God or the wise men? And that's going to be demonstrated in the second chapter. And of course, the thing we're most familiar about the second chapter is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Well, the dream is going to answer both of those questions. Who rules and who's the wise man? It's going to answer by the dream. Now, as we look at the second chapter, I found this in a book I was studying. I found it to be very interesting. This is one of those Hebrew poetry arrangements of text. And it's called a chiasm for those that want the real word, but they arrange in Hebrew text, a lot of times they'll arrange things so that you start with something and you end with the same thing you started with. Like we start with Nebuchadnezzar, we end with Nebuchadnezzar. And then it's kind of arranged into the middle, and the thing in the middle is the most significant thing in the passage. I always thought the dream was the most significant thing in the second chapter. But if you look at it, if this is truly the way the passage is arranged, what's the most significant thing in the second chapter? Daniel's prayer to God. Oh, not just Daniel, but Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They all went one night and prayed to God, and then the answer came to Daniel. That may be the message of the second chapter. We've got a group of people here in captivity. They're in a hard place. They got to get an answer. And where do you go get the answer to God? The answer is significant, but the important thing is getting the right answer. And you know what? Well, the chapter is arranged here. We've got Nebuchadnezzar has a quandary. Well, we know he has a dream and he can't figure it out. That's his quandary. He gets unwise counsel. Nobody can answer that for you, Nebuchadnezzar. Tell us what it is and we'll make up an answer for you. That's basically, he gets that unwise counsel. And of course, that does not sit well with a monarch. Nebuchadnezzar is a monarch. He is an Eastern monarch of this era that if he gets up and doesn't feel good, heads will roll. Literally, heads will roll. So you don't answer him that way. And of course, it didn't. And so he sends Arioch out to kill let's exterminate the wise men. And they go looking for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to include them in the execution. And that's what prompts them to go to God in prayer. They go to God in prayer and they get an answer from God. And so they take that back to Arioch and the consequences are averted. We go in and ask, to God or Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Daniel gives wise counsel, and this is where he tells the dream and interprets it. And I want us to look at this last line here. Nebuchadnezzar goes from one who is confused to one who understands. And so I think this is an interesting way of looking at this passage, and I'm going to kind of follow this outline as we go through this passage tonight. The quandary. A couple of things I want to just note about this. It's in the second year of he has dreams. He has dreams. Sometimes we think about he had a dream. Now, when he goes to describe it, he says, I had a dream. But here he says he had dreams. So I think that suggests that, he had this reoccurring dream that was bothering him. And he didn't understand. He had this, and his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. Have you ever had a dream and you woke up and you couldn't go back to sleep? Apparently, this was a reoccurring problem for him. But you think about who he is. He is the monarch. He is the ruler of the world at this point in time. He's got the same problem that you and I have. He's no different than we are, even though they would have considered him different and he would have considered himself different. He is a person that has like problems that we have. I think that's, to me, that's interesting to note that in this. So that's the quandary. And now we're going to look at his unwise counsel that he received. He goes to we want to make one other thing about the dream. The dream is a challenge from God. I think is the way we have to see the dream, because God is giving him this dream and challenge him, because when Daniel gets to interpret the dream, he said, God showed this to you. So this is a challenge from God to get Nebuchadnezzar's attention, is what the first of it is. Okay, I get to the right page here. Okay, I'm going to read most of this, and I'm trying to make some comments as we go through here. It says, the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, and just at that point in the text, remember we said the text started in Hebrew. When it says they said to the king in Aramaic, this text now, the original text starts in Aramaic and goes Aramaic through the end of the 7th chapter. So they said to the king in Aramaic. Now mine's all in English, so I can't see any difference in the writing here. It says, O king, live forever. One other note there, if you ever get a chance to meet a king and talk with him, this is what you need to say. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your house shall be laid in ruins. Well, he's kind of emphatic, I think I would say. But if you show me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So if you're one of these wise men that he's called in, and you've been faking it, is what you've been doing. You cannot interpret dreams. And now you're put in, in the next section, we're going to see they're going to offer him an alternative because they know they cannot answer his question. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show you its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you don't make known the dream to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me, so times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. He was a pretty sharp little guy. He didn't get to be king of the empire by being stupid. So he knew that if he told them a dream, any of us could make up a story. So, Nebuchadnezzar, about 100 years from now, you're going to tell me something that's way down there when the times are gone, and I won't know if it ever happened or not, and you will have escaped this. And so he says, no, we're not going to play that game. You're going to tell me the dream, or you're going to be torn limb from limb. Now, he's a little bit, what would you say, impetuous. He's a little bit too demanding, because everybody knows that they can't tell them the dream like that. But here we have a fellow that is so full of himself that he thinks that he can demand everything from other people. And that's the picture we have of Nebuchadnezzar. He is so, full of himself and so arrogant that he thinks that you had to deliver what he asked. And I suspect that Nebuchadnezzar had never been told no since he had become the emperor. And Dempsey.
Certainly, it's under incentive if they're able to do this for the so-called wise men and counselors to come through. Like you said, they're fakes, they're deceivers, and he's tired of installing. But if you put it in an equivalent, it would be like the president getting up one day and saying, "I'm tired of your counsel, your advice. I'm going to kill every member of Congress and bulldoze their houses."
Right.
Plenty of incentive to come through there if they could.
And think about this. If he had done that, it'd been like shooting yourself in the foot. They're the best help he's got, and they're not, infallible like God, but they're the best help he's got. If he kills them all, he's not going to have this help. So he's not really doing himself any favor, not doing them any favor, or himself any favor. And that's why I call this the disastrous consequences. We're going to destroy everybody that's got any kind of wisdom at all. We know there were men there who had great education, they were intelligent, and they could make good decisions. But since they couldn't answer this question, he was going to destroy them. And so you've got to tell me the dream, and then I'll know that you can tell me the interpretation. So he's going to keep the dream secret until tell him. And then their answer to him in verse 10 there, he says, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing as of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing which a king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. There's two or three things I want us to note in their response. First of all, they said, there's not a man on earth can answer that. Are they right or wrong? They're absolutely correct. But they take a little backhanded comment here toward the king to this emperor. And you've already got him riled up. So you're going to rally him. Well, you shouldn't be asking us that. Eddie?
He had only been king for 2 years at this point. His father, of course, had been great king who kind of resurrected.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what they're doing here is they're essentially saying, you're not as good as your father.
Right. And so you shouldn't be doing that. Well, you don't do that with an emperor, with a monarch. And so, you shouldn't be asking us that. And the thing you've asked is too difficult. No one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Well, they're right again, except they're wrong about the nature of God. Their concept of gods are the idol gods who are off in some faraway place entertaining themselves or taking care of themselves. That's their concept of God. They're fighting with each other, or they're having romantic relationships. If you read any mythology, that's what their gods were always doing. They were like people who were in a faraway place. And that's their and so they're there, they're not interested in us. So they could figure it out, but they're not interested. And so therefore, we can't give you an answer. And so that's the best they can do. I had not gone far enough. Okay, now the devastating consequences. Because of this, king was angry and very furious. You can see how his temper has been building. And he commanded all the wise men of Babylon to be destroyed, so the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. he, he declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? And Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. A few things I have underlined in the text there. One thing, and I don't know if it's on the screen, he was angry and furious. But everything they have said to him has just been building the anger, which shows his arrogance and his pride. When he didn't get his way, he's like a 3-year-old that's been spoiled that doesn't get their way. Or like a 77 or 76-year-old man that doesn't get his ice cream or something, you know. He just gets upset. So he's angry and furious. And so he just kill them all. Gather them in here. If they can't answer my question, let's destroy them. Like I said, he is harming himself. Yes, he's harming them. So they come to find Daniel. Apparently Daniel and his 3 friends were not with the group that got called in. We don't know why, but they weren't with the group. They called him, and he goes to find them to include them, since they were amongst the wise people. We're going to get them all. We're going to bring them in and have a mass execution, was the thought. And Daniel said, well, what's the upset? I like what it says, Daniel had prudence and discretion. That goes back to the first chapter. You remember when Daniel went to the captain of the guard there about the food? He was polite in doing that and made a request. He didn't demand anything here. He was prudence and discretion. And then after he has that conversation, he requests to go into the king and make requests to the king. And he asks the king for some time, and he will find him an answer. When Daniel went to the king to ask for time, did Daniel know the answer to the dream? What did he have? He had faith in God. He had faith that God would provide the answer. And I think that's really significant for us. And so the other thing I want us to notice about that, he did not answer off the cuff. He went and prayed about it before he gave an answer. That's a lesson for me, and I think for you, is that we need to not always answer immediately. We need to take some time. Now, Daniel goes in, and this is, he goes in and finds his friends, and Daniel went into his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. I think it's interesting here that God gives Daniel, the king has a dream, and Daniel has a vision, but God does not seem to speak directly to either one of them. We see many of the prophets of the Old Testament said that God spoke to them, but God worked through a dream and a vision, in this case, to reveal his information to them. And Daniel and his friends show a great amount of faith in God, that they could, that God would provide. Now, after Daniel makes a request of God, and God gives him the vision, it says, then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. I want you to look at your text in your Bible here in the middle of chapter 2, beginning there in verse 20 down through 24. Is that, in your Bible, is that arranged differently than the text above it and the text below it? It's a poem. Did you notice that? Anytime you're reading through the text of the Bible and you see the text arranged that way, stop. It's a poem. Actually, it's a psalm or a song. Daniel broke out in song when God. Why would he break out in song? He's on the way to an execution, his execution, and God gives him an answer that saves his life, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah's life, and all the wise men. He breaks out in song. Now, let's read the song. He says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. This is a good pattern for a Thanksgiving psalm for us. To whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my Father, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. So here in this prayer, he mentions what I saw as the two questions of the book or this chapter. Who rules? What's he say? God rules. Who is wise? God is wise. And so I think he sees these are two key things in this situation he's in. God rules and God is wise. That is important to answer in this question. God is above Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has threatened death. He is the monarch. He has the power. Yet God is above Nebuchadnezzar. God rules. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know the answer to this. Man doesn't know the answer to this. Daniel and his friends don't know the answer to the dream, but God does, and he provides the answer. And because this in verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision in the night. God revealed the mystery. Yes, Dempsey.
Yes, brother, and I agree that the sovereignty of God, wisdom just shines through here. Of course, he's placing his servant there in Babylon. He's here. And I would also suggest, Daniel prays in verse 18. First of all, Daniel thanked God after all this.
Right.
It's always impressive. He thanked God. He was not the king. But it says in verse 18 that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed. God is compassionate.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that, because here we've got all these people that are about to be killed. This, what we have here, this is a type of Jesus Christ saving us. Daniel and his friends saved all the wise men by bowing down for God and asking for compassion. If it hadn't been for Daniel and his three friends, all the wise men would have been killed. So it's a type, so if it hadn't been for Jesus, we all would die in our sins. So this again shows God's mercy and his compassion. And that's what Daniel asked them to in verse 18. He told his friends, y'all seek mercy from God. And so God's a merciful and a compassionate God. So I think it's it. So there are many lessons in this second chapter is layered with lessons for us. It's not just about the dream. Everybody's still interested in the dream to get to the dream. The dream is just kind of the punctuation mark to me of the chapter. The chapter is filled with lessons. And this lesson is, again, prayer to God. The answer comes from God. And then, because of God answering the prayer, consequences are averted. Does that look like salvation to us? Our consequences are averted because God sent the answer in Jesus Christ. This is, again, the book of Daniel is showing us a merciful and compassionate God, how he deals with his people. he's got these people, Daniel and his friends. He's dealing with them and take care of them. Okay, in verse 24, then therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And he went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. A couple of things I want to just mention there. One is Arioch probably did not relish his job. How would you like to execute a whole room full of people? And Arioch probably knew all of them pretty well because he's been the king's administrator and they're in his court. So friends of his. And so he probably didn't. So he comes, he's glad Daniel's gone. And so in haste, he goes into the king. But then he says, I found the fellow. Arioch, he's going to kind of get a little bit of credit for this now. Daniel's going to give the answer, but Arioch says, I found you somebody. King, don't forget that. So consequences are averted because God gives Daniel and his friend the answer in the night based upon their faith in him, their prayer. So now we're going to have wise counsel from Daniel to the king as he presents it. It says, and the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. That's the same answer that other group of wise men gave the king. There's not a man on earth, whether he's an astrologer, a magician, or a Chaldean, that can answer this. But they had said the gods aren't with us. They're far off. Daniel says, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king, to King Nebuchadnezzar, what will be in latter days. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Now, there's a couple of things I want to suggest with that. The fact that God reveals things, that suggests that he communicates. He has interest in, and he is not remote, but he is near. That's what Daniel, I think, is saying. Yes, it takes God to do this, but there is a God in heaven who reveals and reaches out to us, shows mercy and grace to us. And so the difference in the Chaldean concept of God and Jehovah God, as Daniel understands him, is that Jehovah God is close and merciful, and there's their remote and don't care. Thoughts here?
Very typical of God, they invented them and gave them personalities and traits. And then said, well, if the gods can do that, so can we.
Right.
And so very self-serving.
Right.
They were very immoral, very corrupt.
All their concepts of God, I don't say all, but most of their concepts of God revolved around immorality. That's because they were created in their mind, and that's what they were thinking about, and which is kind of the way our society is today in that. Now, and so Daniel says God is interested. He reveals secrets, mysteries, and he has, and we're going to see here, and he says, your dream and the visions you had as you lay in your bed are these. You, O king, lay in your bed, came thoughts of what would be after this, and he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, the mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your mind. This is a couple of things I want to notice about this section here. God has revealed it for your benefit. He didn't reveal it for my benefit. And it's not because of me that this revelation has come. It's for your benefit. That's got to make out quite a few implications here. God is interested in the monarch, the king of Babylon. Now, we know that that king is accountable to God, but God is interested in him. That's to me, that's something that's significant here. It wasn't because of any wisdom I have, but because God is is interested in you. Now, there's one little thing that I skipped there and didn't comment on at the end of verse 28, in the middle of verse 28. And I want us to think about that for just a moment, because I think this is one of the first clues about the dream he has. He says, but there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known on King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. It's not just for the king's benefit, but here's an important piece of information about the latter days that God has revealed to the king. And so, as I say, I think that's the first clue for us that there's something significant about this revelation. The term the latter days or last days appears numerous times in the Old Testament. I have two of them on the board here. One is in Genesis 49 and in verse 1. This is the time that Jacob is old, and he's called his 12 sons to them, and he's going to give them a blessing. And that's what it says. And Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I might tell you that which will befall you in the last days, or the latter days. Some translations put it. Then in verse 10, he's talking about Judah. He says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and to him shall be the gathering of people be. We all understand that Jacob is talking about Judah being the ruling tribe, and there being one who would come, or Judah, there would be one who would come through Judah who would be the Christ. We see this as a messianic message. The latter days, something messianic is going to occur. The passage in Isaiah 2, verses 2-3, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in the top of the mountains, and shall to be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the Lord of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. We understand that's another messianic, pointing to the time of Jesus. But it's called in the last days, or the latter days, this will happen. And so when you see in the Old Testament the word latter days or last days, it is messianic in nature. And so I think we can conclude from that, Daniel is saying to Nebuchadnezzar here, God's giving you a messianic message here, that in your dream, there's something about messianic times and message in the dream. Now, when we go and see the dream, we're going to see very definitely it is messianic, and it's in what it's saying. Now we finally get to the dream, and we're just about out of time. Eddie?
What you just said, and I fully agree with what you're talking about there. What we see is a symbol of the greatest king on earth, pointing to what will be God's great king.
Okay.
And that's what that dream really does, is it bridges from that greatest king on earth to the king that God chooses.
And as we get into the interpretation of the dream here, we're going to see that Nebuchadnezzar is given credit for being the greatest king And I don't know whether that's in the context up to that point in time or in the futures, but he is given credit for being the pinnacle of kingship. Let's state it that way. And so the pinnacle of kingship is Nebuchadnezzar, and God is going to have a pinnacle above that. I think is where we're going with the dream. And so we're not going to have time to get into the dream tonight because the dream has lots of things we need to talk about. I just want to make a couple more comments and we'll be done tonight. You can see where God is going with Nebuchadnezzar here. And when we start I hadn't said anything about this yet. Chapter 7 is parallel to chapter 2. And chapter 8 is parallel to about half of chapter 2 and chapter 7. So we're going to talk about the dream some next Sunday night, but we'll get into some of the details when we get to chapter 7 and 8. And so I did want us to, one of the problems with this dream, and when we get to chapter 7 and particularly chapter 9, people want to come to the book of Daniel and they want to create all kinds of unusual ideas and messages about a second coming, a millennium and 1,000 years and all this kind. They want to create all those things. That's one reason I wanted to point out that in the latter days or the last days is always in the Old Testament, messianic or talking about the time when the Christ comes, when he's anointed or he comes. And so right off, he gives Nebuchadnezzar that hint, the same term, and that's going to kind of put a time frame on these events in the times of chapter 2 and 7, 8, time frame on that. A couple of things I want you to look at, and we're going to talk more about this when we get to chapter 7. Some translations in the dream there, they have a great image. Some use statue. I want you to think about where you see the word image used in the Bible before we get here next week. And I also want you to, when you get down to the interpretation, let me turn down to that. Yeah, verse 37. See what God has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into your hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of men, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, make you rule over them all. Find almost identical passage to that in the Old Testament. That's interesting to me as we have this great king and God, he said, God gave this to you. And so some of the things, there's all kinds of, to me, messages and lessons from this. One of those is God placed Nebuchadnezzar where he was. God, and that's one of the messages all through the book of Daniel, God put the kings where they are. And I think even today, God puts the rulers where they are. Now, one of the things that we might want to discuss somewhere along in this is, does that mean that I don't need to vote if God puts them there? Does that mean I don't need to be involved in government? That would be an interesting conversation, wouldn't it? And so, but I do think we can never give up on the idea that God is in charge. And that's what the message we're going to see of this dream is, that God is in charge. He is over everything and over everybody, and everybody's accountable to him. And so I'm going to quit with that tonight. So remember to go back and find this almost parallel passage in the Bible, and we'll go back and look at God giving this to Nebuchadnezzar next Sunday night. Okay, let's quit with that. And Matt, would you lead us in prayer?
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this evening, another chance to study your word.
a chance to reflect on how we conduct ourselves, a chance to see your might and majesty and the longitudinal power of your word. And we pray, Father, that we will take that awe and that power of your word with us as we go throughout our lives, that people will see Christ in us and wish to become more Christ-like themselves. We pray that these words will have impact on us and guide our actions throughout the week, so that we will extol you in everything that we do, that we will watch ourselves and flee from sin, and that we will always be giving glory and honor to you in everything we do, because it is thanks to you, just like Daniel's interpretation, just like these interpretations of Prudence we see here in this book. Father, if you will, please be with us throughout the week. Please not only us, but the entire world, because it is war torn, it is sick, it is impoverished, it is lacking you. And obviously the world needs you in many ways, and we pray that you will guide it. Please, Father, forgive us of our sins. All of this we pray in the name of Christ. Amen.